Welcome to the Amaze webinar about the SEN white paper and SEND reforms. Liam and I will start by introducing ourselves. So I'm Ros, I'm Head of Services at Amaze. I've been involved in the SEND world for many years and seen a few different reforms come through and trying to make sense of this one for you. Liam.
Hello, I'm Liam. I'm the SENDIASS manager. That's the advice line for parent carers in Brighton and Hove and in East Sussex. I've worked in the world of SEND for about 30 years now. So like Ros, seen a lot of changes and proposed changes. So here we go again.
And because we're recording this and sharing it with anyone who wants to watch, we just wanted to let people know what Amaze is and why we might be making a webinar about the SEND white paper. So we're a charity and we were set up by parent carers to help parent carers, and most of us who work here are either parent carers or have differences or disabilities ourselves, and we cover Brighton and Hove and East Sussex, but anyone in the country is welcome to watch our videos. And we've always worked kind of closely with local authorities and health services, but about trying to make the system work better.
What are we going to be talking about today are the big proposals, and there are lots of them in the white paper. We're going to go into a little bit more detail for the things which are very SEND specific. Ros is then going to tell you how you can get involved in the consultation process. And then at the end, we'll go through the chat where you've put your questions and we will attempt to answer those for you.
And we won't be able to offer really individual advice in this session, but that's what SENDIASS is there for. And if you're watching this in another area, use your local SENDIASS service.
Okay, so now what is the white paper? So you're already using the jargon about the white paper. So the white paper is any government proposal. They produce these papers and they put them out for consultation. So it shows what the thinking of the government is and what they would like to do. But then it's all subject to the feedback that we all give, and then it has to go through Parliament. There are lots of processes before it happens. So this white paper that we're looking at is called Every Child Achieving and Thriving. So it's looking at children and young people and how they progress and succeed as they move through education and into adulthood. It's looking at wider inequalities, so features such as poverty. It's not just about SEND. There are 7 chapters. And we will touch on all of them, but chapter 3 is the one with sort of the big SEND proposals that you may already have heard about. So we'll spend some more time looking at chapter 3, as there are some significant proposals there.
So why is there a white paper with changes to education and particularly to SEND? And I think that all of us that are working the SEND system one way or another know that it's not working perfectly at the moment. Families, the questions they bring to us as a SENDIASS service suggest that they're not happy with how things are working at the moment, the current SEND provision, how the processes work. You know, again and again, what you were coming and asking us is, do I have to get an EHCP to get the right support for my child? What should be happening in school for them? I don't think my child's needs can be met in a mainstream school. So, there's a groundswell of feeling that the system is a bit, some people say broken, but certainly not perfect. The Department of Education has real concerns about it too. They have heard families saying that it feels like you always have to fight to get provision. They're aware that there are waiting lists for services, that there are things that it feels like you can only get if you've got a diagnosis, say. There's worries about outcomes. What do children with SEND get by the end of their education? Are they, we've got a statistic here about not getting good results in maths or English. But for some children with SEND, it's not about that. It's about whether they're leaving school and college ready to participate sort of actively and happily in adult life. So achievement appropriate to the young person is an issue. And but generally, it seems that young people do better in mainstream schools, even if they have SEND. Real worry, as I say, about adult lives and the number of young people with special educational needs and disabilities who are another acronym NEET, not in education, employment, or training as they start adult life, and that's not okay. So there's an ambition, I suppose, the positive ambition behind the white paper is about, can we make the system more inclusive? Can we be more ambitious for children with SEND?
So we'll just do an overview of some of the other chapters. As we go through, you'll see on the slides that we've written some pros and cons. Now, these aren't the only views, but it's just to sort of give you some ideas of the kind of things that we're thinking about in response to some of these chapters. So chapter
Interesting.
1 is about services working together. So there's this real ambition for education, health and council services to be working well. Now, this is something that's been intended for a long time. The EHCP should be a real example of how that's working, but clearly there's a lot more that needs to be done. There's a focus on early years, so it's really trying to get support for families and to children, young people at those early stages, so that in every area will have a Best Start family hub, and there'll be a SEND worker in all of those services. So if parents are concerned about their child, they're wondering if they have got SEND or if they've had a diagnosis, there should be someone there to help at early stages. There's a recognition of the importance of every child starting the school day having had a nutritional breakfast. So every primary school, the intention is to have a breakfast club, a free breakfast club for all the children. Something that's could be of interest to us in Sussex is the Mission Coastal proposals. So that's looking at disadvantaged coastal areas, and they'll be announced as they go along, but it's likely that there will be quite a few of those in Sussex who will get extra funding around disadvantage. Every school or educational setting will have to publish an inclusion strategy. So there's a really keen focus on making all of the system inclusive so that children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities are included and are able to access all of the services and the facilities that are available to other children. And there's going to be a demand on schools to work with other local schools to drive that inclusion. So there's very much a focus on schools working together. Chapter 2 is about better experiences at school. So it's recognising that the experience of children is very mixed at the moment. Those of you who've had a child who's gone through a transition point, moving from nursery to primary, primary to secondary, or on to college, will know how important those transition points are and how it doesn't always work. Transition starts early. It takes as long as that child or young person needs. So there's a recognition of that and a change of how schools work with your child or young person around the changes they're making. There's a really big focus in the curriculum on literacy, oracy, and numeracy. So oracy is about speaking skills, because they recognise that those skills really inform the rest of a child's learning and their progress. That early start with literacy and oracy will really impact on their learning throughout school. Preparation for adulthood has been something that's been in place for again quite a while, but it's got mixed results. So there's a recognition that there needs to be a really important focus on education that prepares children, young people for their adulthood and whatever that may be. So it's that long-term planning, giving them the skills they need to move forward into adult life. Enrichment is something that needs to be looked at. So lots of schools might have lots of activities, but they're not always accessible. So it's making sure that every child is able to access everything that goes on in school. It's not just about being in the classroom learning, it's all of those additional things which build the social skills and the opportunities to develop new interests. Careers advice and work experience are seen as really important. Again, you'll know that a lot of children, young people with SEND aren't getting the same access to the specialist careers advice that they might need. So that will be a change. There are some new qualifications. So alongside A levels and T levels, there are these new V levels. So they're much more vocational and about getting young people ready for work, but they will carry the same weight as an A level. So for young people who don't want to go down that academic route, it's a way of getting a similar qualification, but in something they're more interested in. There will also be new pathways to employment and to further study, so that it's making sure that as many young people as possible are having opportunities to move into employment. Outcomes for children and young people with SEND and for other disadvantaged pupil groups are key to all of this, so schools will be really focusing on that. And there will be some national inclusion standards. So that's going to be a library that's open to all schools, and it will be tools that will help schools to identify needs, and it will be full of ideas and resources for meeting the needs of those children and young people.
Now we're moving on to chapter 3, and chapter 3 is the one that has most about SEND provision and changes to the SEND system. So while we're giving you the other chapters, so you've got an overview, because there's SEND related bits in all of them, this is where it gets chunky. Okay. And what we're going to try and do all the way through is talk about what's being suggested, think if there's any positives in that we might think, oh yeah, that's good, that will be better, and whether there's anything in there that we might be wanting to understand more about, might be worried about, might be thinking, is this going to be in any way unhelpful for our children and young people? And that might inform things that you might put in the consultation response if you do one, which we'll come to later. So chapter 3 is including every child, and it's about having, for a start, making the universal offer for all children and young people more inclusive. I mean, at the moment, schools, colleges, early years settings, they do have a lot of strategies that they use to meet the needs of children and young people. They do have a range of resources, but we all know that it can be hard to hold schools. And when we say schools all the way through here, we're also talking about early years settings and colleges. Take that as read. Okay. It's hard to hold them to account on inclusion. And the white paper is saying we want to push forward inclusion and make it something that schools are judged on more, are pushed to do more, and are made more accountable about. So the proposals are a universal offer about high quality, timely support. So early help and not holding up getting support to a young person when they need it, when their needs are first identified. As always, and let's hope it really happens, talking about partnership with families. Also, there's going to be things in it about belonging and attendance. And it's really interesting that they've framed attendance, school attendance, also with talking about belonging. So it's not just a sort of punitive way of thinking about attendance. And crucially, Ofsted are going to be given the task of judging schools about how inclusive they are, which has been one of the failings of the system up to now. That the things that Ofsted are checking in a school haven't adequately made them accountable and judged on how inclusive they are. So, really positive stuff about early intervention, high quality teaching and learning for all children and young people, an emphasis, as Liam was saying, on making all aspects of school life inclusive, not just the learning. But what would our concern? So, essentially, all things that we probably very positively embrace. The question might be, when do children get identified and how to get more targeted support? If we're big emphasis on, oh, we'll do this for everybody that needs it. And at the moment, the trust isn't there, is there, often between families and the education system about whether their child's needs will be met, and that drives people perhaps to go, say, for an education, health and care plan because the trust isn't there. So will the resources be there to rebuild that trust? So one of the ways they're framing this is talking about layers of support. in the current system, you'll know there's the sort of universal, what all children get. There's SEN support when it's been identified a child has some special educational needs, and then there's education, health and care plans. And of those bits, only the education, health and care plan has any sort of legal force, is a legal document. The proposal is there'll be these new national inclusion standards, which are going to be a legal duty for all mainstream provision to promote inclusion. So universal provision for all children and young people, but then individual support plans for those children who need additional support. And that can be in one of three layers. Important to note that a child or young person can come in at any one of those layers. You have to work your way up through them if you need to be say on if you need specialist support. You have to start at targeted and work through. So targeted, that's for they describe it as children and young people with commonly occurring conditions. So things that affect a lot of children but do need targeted support. And so it's about high quality support on demand, so not having to go through a complex process for that. And it would include things like, being taught in small groups, things that happen in the classroom, but potentially also time in an inclusion base in school. And we'll talk a bit more about those inclusion bases in a sec. So then layer 2 is targeted plus. So we've got targeted plus. That's for children with less common needs that need some specialist involvement. And we'll explain a bit more about these experts at hand. But that's about professionals that are available to the school to give that more specialist input, and about inclusion bases, more use of inclusion bases in a mainstream school. Potentially, Targeted Plus could also involve alternative provision or a specialist setting for a time, a short time, as opposed to the children that might need that throughout their education. Then layer 3 is specialist support. So that is described as being for children and young people with complex needs. And all these things we're talking about here, we're going to tell you a bit more about, but use of specialist provision packages, which say what extra help a child or young person needs. And this is where EHCPs will come in. So only at the specialist support layer. So where a child or young person is identified as needing a specialist provision package, that then they are the ones that would have an education, health and care plan. And you would only be able to go to a special school or a specialist base rather than a sort of inclusion base, a specialist base within a mainstream school with an EHCP. So positives in this, it's probably helpful to have 3 layers rather than 2. At the moment it's like SEN support or EHC plan and nothing in between. It's identifying a need for individualized support plans. That's a positive. What would our concerns be? Who identifies and how that a child belongs in one of these layers? Who decides, if they're targeted or targeted plus? How easy will it be to move around between them? Specialist support talks about complex needs, how a complex need is going to be defined, and will you have to already be on targeted plus, say, in order to or identified as needing specialist support in order to request an EHC needs assessment?
So individual support plans are one of the proposals. Now, this means that every child with special education needs and disability will have an individual support plan. At the moment, if your child doesn't have an EHCP, then hopefully they've got some sort of documentation in school for their SEN support. Now, that might be called an individual education plan, it might be called an additional needs plan, or it can be called any name that the school calls it. They are reviewed whenever they need to be, in theory, but there's nothing really pinning it down. The guidance is that it should happen every term. but we know that that's not the case across all schools. So it's quite difficult to know what your child should be getting or how it's being recorded. And of course, then when they move schools, they could be moving somewhere that's got a completely different system, and there's an opportunity for the support to drop at that point. So the proposal is that every child will have an individual support plan, and that includes those with the EHCPs, which we'll talk about later. There will be a legal duty for nurseries, schools, and colleges to create these ISPs, these individual support plans, when they're needed and to maintain them. So it's supposed to address that fact that it can be quite hard to get school to actually draw up any documentation, and then maintain it. The ISP will be reviewed at least annually, so it should be more often, but at least once a year it will be reviewed. And if it's not working, or if the school isn't delivering it, then there will be a tightened up school complaints process. And if that doesn't work, there will be an independent panel. So lots of things that are potentially positive there. I mean, it's good news that this document will be standardized. So it'll be across the country, it will be the same format, it will be digital, so it'll be very easy to move it between schools, colleges, nurseries, and also it can be reviewed at any time. You shouldn't have to wait a year. So if your child's needs change or it looks like the provision isn't working, you'll be able to get that reviewed. You won't have to wait for the year. But there are some concerns because there's no detail in the proposals about how you would be able to hold the school to account if they weren't creating an ISP or if they weren't maintaining it. Now, the white paper isn't intended to have all of the detail, but the concern there is without that details, how do we know whether it's going to be positive or not? So that's the risk. Also, there's nothing in there about the legal duty to deliver the support. So it says that legally they have to draw up an ISP and they have to maintain it. But what if they're not delivering it? What is the legal comeback for parent carers if they've got that concern? Also, how do we ensure that the reviews are thorough and that they're person-centred? What we don't want is that once a year you're brought in for 15 minutes to see the Senko and you look and say, oh, it hasn't really worked this year, so we'll just roll it on for another year and see what happens. There needs to be some more detail so that you can be confident that your review will have a look at what your child's needs are, what their barriers to learning are, what reasonable adjustments can be put in place, and what the support package is going to look like and how that's reviewed.
So, moving on to specialist provision packages, that new term, and EHCPs. So, we all know that at the moment that there's law, there's a code of practice, but local authorities, to an extent, have their own rules about who's eligible for assessment. They apply the law in a local way, and obviously it can be challenged, but nevertheless, quite often it can feel like what's in an EHCP relates to what's available locally, and they're not as person-centered as you would wish. And there's lots of different EHCP formats around, and that one of the things that's been trialed in the last few years that's been successful is moving to a national consistent framework or format for EHCPs that's easier to move from place to place. So the proposal is that there should be, and of course, the proposal is consistent high quality support for those children with the most complex needs. And EHCPs will be linked to the fact that a child has been identified as needing a specialist provision package. So what are these specialist provision packages, you ask? So this is about having 7 areas of need. So not specific diagnoses, but areas of need, a bit like, at the moment there are areas of need identified in the SEND code of practice, but these 7 creates more, and they take them further away from sort of diagnosis and more about thinking, what does the child actually need? But each of those 7 areas will have a list of kind of possible provision from which provision specifically for that child would need will be chosen. So, and they could have in their specialist provision package a mix of provision from more than one of the 7 areas of need and the packages attached to that area of need. and then those will inform the HCP, which will all use the same template. It's a little hard for us, I think, to get our head around until we see what these specialist provision packages might look like, what the list of possible provision might be. But the idea is it's a bit more standardised, that it's not that there isn't a postcode lottery around the country of, that what you get in East Sussex attached to your EHCP should be similar to what you'd get in Wolverhampton, say. And the EHCPs will then be reviewed. Now, this is an interesting change. They will be reviewed at the end of a phase of education. So at those key transition points that Liam was mentioning a little earlier. But the ISP will be reviewed much more frequently. So, at the moment, sometimes you can have an annual review of your education, health and care plan, and that's not fully resolved before you get round to the next annual review. Or you end up with, very out of date things in the education, health and care plan. And what's actually happening day to day is quite different, but because it's the annual review process is quite cumbersome, it doesn't get updated. So the idea is that you have the broad bits in the plan, and they're reviewed as you move into a different phase, like from primary to secondary, say, but that the ISP can be updated much more frequently and in a more sort of reactive, useful way. So standardized packages, EHCP templates to make things more consistent, better if you have to move. Those packages are supposed to be really well designed by experts with parent carers involved in testing, reviewed by a national panel, better monitoring of progress and provision linked to them. So less dependent on what your local authority or school does and more consistency. But again, thinking about concerns, we've got this, what are the most complex needs? That's not clear at the moment in the white paper, and is something we might want to ask to be defined a bit more clearly. What if the provision that you feel that your child needs is not on the sort of, not listed in these existing packages? It's not clear how families are going to be involved in the creation of the specialist provision package. It is clear that they'll be involved in the education, health and care plan process, but because that's built on the SPP, you'd want to be involved in that as well. And at the moment, it's a lot, because this white paper has come out from the Department of Education, it's not so clear about how the health and social care elements will be integrated into SSPs. And is there an issue with not having an annual review for the EHCP? Is it enough to annually or more frequently review the ISP and leave it longer between reviews of the EHCP?
So we're looking at specialist settings now. So these will be available for children and young people with an EHCP. At the moment, there are theoretically lots of options that you can request, but as we know, more and more parent carers are requesting specialist settings. That could be to do with losing faith in the more mainstream settings, or thinking that they can access more services that way. Of course, there are limited number of specialist places. So the proposal is that there will still be wide options for parent carers to choose for their child or young person. But there are these new mainstream schools that have specialist bases. Now, they're already in existence in some local authorities, but there's going to be a real push for secondary schools. Eventually, the idea would be that every secondary school would have a specialist base. Now, that will be quite a flexible space that can be used for different things. The idea is that the local authority will look at the support packages and the EHCP, and they will identify the possible schools or other settings. So rather than you just naming any school or setting that you want, in theory, across England, you will now be given a list of settings that you can choose from. If you don't agree with all of any of the options on that, you will still have the right to pick another setting, though. So it's not completely removing that. But the idea is initially you will be given a number of schools to choose from. There's also going to be reform of independent special schools. So they're going to be looking at the price that they charge, and also really looking at the quality standards of those schools to sort of bring them in line with other options. Now, the positives, it could be that having this pre-approved list means that the consultation has been done before you get to the point where you're choosing. At the moment, there are lots of children, young people who are getting bounced back from settings, schools saying we can't meet need, can't meet need. So the idea of this should be that all of the schools on the list can meet the needs of the child or the young person. Once the SSP has been agreed, that support package has been agreed, the setting have to deliver it. So you won't get one on your list that you then choose and then say we can't meet need. That's what it's trying to remove. The concern is, of course, is that there is no guidance about what happens if you want to go off the list. But how long might you then have to wait? And what is the process for that consultation? So you still have the right to pick something else, but how would it work in practice? Also, if you wanted to go with your local mainstream and it wasn't on the list, how difficult is it going to be to get that? Because this is all about inclusion. So it's about making sure that all children and young people have the opportunity to be educated in a mainstream setting if that's what they want. But what happens if you want your local school and it's not on your list? That hasn't been addressed.
So, thinking about transition to the new system, and before I say the things that are on this slide, the first thing to say about this is just reminding ourselves that this is a white paper. So this means these are proposals, ideas, and this has to go through the process of consultation and then through the process of becoming legislation. So becoming a green paper, going through Parliament, getting agreed, the law changing, and then and only then can any of this actually start. Although there are elements of investment, and we'll come to that later on, more money being put into the system that is starting sooner, but actual changes to the law takes a couple of years in effect. So the first actual transition to the new system will start in 2029, 2030. And just remembering that under the new system, EHCPs will be reviewed at transition phases. So the change will be brought in for children who currently have an education, health and care plan, is that they will be assessed at the end of each education phase to see if they need a specialist provision package, to see specialist support, and then their EHCP will be updated with details from that specialist provision package. And at that point, that would be the moment when it's possible that for some children and young people, they might say, oh, actually, we're making mainstream schools more inclusive. They could be supported at that targeted plus level, say, with an ISP. They no longer need an education, health and care plan. So as it stands, nothing should change for existing children with EHCPs until the first of them hit the first of those transition points. So children currently in year 3 or above will be keeping their EHCP until they're at least age 16 because they won't hit that a transition point until after the legislation takes effect. But children currently in year 2 or below will be reassessed as they transition in from year 6 to year 7. A key thing that's been put in this white paper about transition is to say that any child that's already in a special school will not be asked to move. If you wanted your child to move out of special into mainstream, they could, but no one is going to be forced to move out of a special school if they're in one, because that's about consistency, continuity of experience for children. But children will start to be being assessed under the new system from 2029 onwards, and children already with the HCPs, as I say, it won't be until they're the first transition after that to a different phase of education. So that basically means only those that are under year 3 at the moment will have a significant reassessment. Then, obviously, the moment that you're talking about change and new systems, as parents, you think, oh, what if we're not happy? What if we need to appeal? And the current system it involves quite a lot of people going to some kind of appeal, doesn't it? And rightly, I'm sure, the white paper suggests, can we make some changes that will reduce people's need to appeal or feeling that they have to appeal? So they're saying, well, we're going to make SENDIASS stronger and better. So that's your source of impartial information, advice, and support. So they're supporting SENDIASS. They're going to put more emphasis on access to mediation and not about forcing people into mediation, but making mediation more available faster and trying to make local authorities comply with the expectations of how they come to mediation and how they approach it and participate in mediation. Tribunal will still exist. It's still going to be the legal backstop for the really key decisions about EHCPs and specialist support packages. But there will be some changes to what a tribunal can decide on. And one key change is that tribunal will be looking at whether an EHCP is needed and which specialist support packages are needed, but it won't be naming a school. It will only be able to tell the local authority that they must reassess. So they will be about, you will still be able to appeal if there's a refusal to assess for an education, health and care plan. There'll still be possible to appeal about whether, having done that assessment, an EHCP is needed and what the specialist provision packages are that are appropriate for the child. There will be the right to appeal about whether a type of school is it, whether specialist provision is needed, but not, they won't be able to name a school. And you would also be able to appeal if the local authority was suggesting ceasing an education, health and care plan. That would still be open to appeal. So those are the key decisions are still appealable. Just to mention, they're also talking about giving some more support to parent carer forums. So the collective voice for parents, as well as supporting SENDIASS and mediation, some strengthening for parent carer forums as well.
So, experts at hand, that's the phrase that they're using for all of those specialist services which a lot of children, young people with SEND need. At the moment, we know there are services there, but the schools have to buy in a lot of that. And so if their budgets are overstretched, those services often can't be bought in. Even when there is the money, we know that lots of the services are really overstretched. So there are long wait times to get speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist in for your child. So the proposal is that all of these services will be referred to as experts at hand, and there will be increased funding. So as we see there, by 2029, the idea is that that provision will be available to all schools, and it will be an equivalent of 40 days of specialist services for a primary and 160 days of specialist services for a secondary school. So, a lot of schools will see a huge increase on having access to occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, and educational psychologists. We know, for example, that the educational psychologists at the moment, most of their time seems to be involved in EHCPs, in doing those assessments, writing those reports up. But that means that they're not having the time to do that day-to-day work with children and young people in schools and colleges that's needed. So there is a proposal to increase funding for recruitment and training. So that's a positive. However, that we need to make sure that once we've recruited and trained those staff, that we hold on to them. At the moment, there is a real brain drain with a lot of those specialist services. People move into the private sector because it's more lucrative and it can be more satisfying. Maybe that's the reason, because they're moving away from just writing reports and doing more of that hands-on work that they wanted to do. So potential for positives, but we have to be, keep an eye on it. It's fine having this theoretical idea of how many days availability there will be, but that depends on recruiting and retaining those staff. So a little bit more on those bases that we're looking at in schools. So at the moment, and some of your children, young people may be attending these units, which have different names and different functions. There is this proposal for inclusion bases. and it can be used for the needs that are set up by the school. There will be two types of bases. So the school will fund support bases that offer targeted support. So if we think back to the new layers of provision, that targeted support is sort of equivalent to the SEN support at the moment. Then also the local authority will fund specialist bases offering specialist support. So similar to what there are now, if there's a hearing impaired unit, for example, in your school, that would be considered more of a specialist base to meet a particular need. Now, the positive is that this inclusion base can be used for all sorts of things. So you might have children being brought in there for small group work. It might be that for those children and young people who are struggling with the noise and the crowds all day, it gives them a time to move into a calmer area. That might be used as a quiet area, or it could be for small group time. If they're not quite ready to be in the school 100% of the time in all the other classes, part of their day might be in the unit. Could be an adapted curriculum, so more of a specialist service being delivered from there, or personal care. So it means that's offering more inclusion because there are opportunities for personal care. Of course, the risk with an inclusion base, and this is a fear of many parent carers, is there a risk of segregating rather than including? So would your child be in this unit for most of the time, not having opportunities to mix with the other children? Now, the white paper is proposing inclusion and saying this wouldn't happen, but obviously you'd need to see how a unit works before you might be confident about wanting your child to attend. And also, if you think that your child needs a special school because of all of the services and the environment that offers, could that actually be replicated through having a unit within a mainstream school? I think the government would say yes, that's the intention, but again, we'd need to see how that panned out.
Now, those were all the relevant parts of chapter 3, which is the specific chapter about SEND and inclusion. But chapter 4 of the white paper is an important one for our SEND children too, because it's the one about sort of attendance and, as it says, withdrawn to engaging. So at the moment, there are very high levels, and this is true across the country, and including in East Sussex and Brighton and Hove, high levels of children and young people who are missing education. So are absent, 1 in 5 absent for a day or more every fortnight. A lot of teaching time being lost or learning time for our children. So one of the focuses of the white paper is there anything different we can do to change that? They're talking about making classrooms calm and safe, and real clear expectations of what schools should do and what's expected of parent carers in that. An emphasis on rewards and recognition rather than just sanctions in school policies. An interesting one, this, that suspensions, what we used to call fixed term exclusions, should predominantly happen on site. So rather than sending children home for a suspension or a fixed term exclusion, and as they say, sending them home to just like maybe, be online and they might be happy to be at home, that more should happen within school, and that schoolwork should be set for all excluded children so that their lost learning is avoided. And the white paper is promising national guidance that will be really clear and practical about suggesting the kind of reasonable adjustments that a school can make to support children and young people so that they're less likely to not attend. So really, taking on board that a lot of non-attendance is linked to a lack of those reasonable adjustments. And I know that, many of you will have had those experiences of behaviour policies, say, in school that are not inclusive and that almost push our children out of school. So on the positive, they're talking about creating online guidance for parent carers about things to do to help support learning at home. And they're going to say that in addressing attendance, the focus has to be on understanding what children need early on and getting the right support in place. It's obvious perhaps, but that isn't always what happens at the moment, that it's about, meeting children's needs sooner so as to improve attendance. And yes, that key one about those behaviour policies that are often at the moment not inclusive, can be very rigid, can really have a very sort of negative impact for children with SEND, and that they should, be more about understanding a child needs and making reasonable adjustments where needed. This all sounds splendid, doesn't it? What would be our worries about this? One would be about, will we have the high quality school provision that will mean that parent carers and schools are working together positively, and that there's not what we often, sadly do see at the moment of where families and parents in particular get blamed for poor attendance. How will all this sort of guidance about supporting learning at home, will that work for children? Some children see these things very separately. School is where school work happens, and home shouldn't be about that. How will that work? There isn't at the moment a timeline about the guidance on reasonable adjustments, which is an element that's really important, I think, to our community. And when you're saying, oh, we're going to set out clearly what's expected of parent carers around attendance and home learning. Well, what if people don't fit with those expectations? What will there be sanctions, and if so, what might they be? Then again, working together is a key element throughout the white paper, but particularly around attendance. So it's looking at the fact that at the moment there's a lot of movement with children, particularly going to alternative provision, but also managed moves, which are often being used, but are often don't seem to be particularly effective. It's just pushing the problem to a different place rather than resolving what a child needs. And these create risks of children missing out on learning if alternative provision isn't good or they're just moved around. So emphasis on checking that children are flourishing at school, and on belonging, which I think is really important for our children, isn't it? Better information for parent carers about schools, making it unlawful to exclude a child or young person because the school says they can't meet their SEND needs, so they can't use that as a reason to exclude. Monitoring what's going on with pupil movement, which is a healthy change, because what we don't want is out of sight or is out of mind, or children being sort of bumped off from a school without anyone noticing. That hidden children problem. And simplifying the school complaints process. So positives in that, yeah, good to be better informed about schools. These complaints panels will have a SEND specialist sitting on them, school complaints panels, but there isn't a lot in here about part-time timetables and how that might be addressed, about, when a school thinks they can't meet needs. There isn't a lot of detail about where a family might go if they've exhausted the school complaints process. And, that is a worry, how these school complaints panels will work, and what happens when you've exhausted that complaints process. So, as with all these proposals, a mix of positives and slight, how is this going to work? Actually, I'm just going to go back to that slide just to say, one of the things that we see in the white paper as a whole is that there's not a lot in there about EOTAS education otherwise than at school, and children who are currently out of school. And that might be something that you might want to pick up on if you're responding to the consultation, that it's not really clear about where children are currently unable to attend or are missing school, how the white paper is going to address them beyond these bits about attendance.
So the government has announced several £billion worth of new funding to invest into the system. With that, that will include 6,500 more teachers. There'll be better teacher training about SEND and about inclusion to all staff. So there won't be this real pressure on the SENCO being in charge of everything. It's all staff should be buying into these values and have the skills to support all children. There's going to be targeted support at head teachers and other leaders of education settings to improve their performance and mean that they can run more effective schools. But the next one I think is a biggie. All of the youth who have children or young people who need a teaching assistant, whether that's in their EHCP or you just know that's what they would benefit from, there's been a real shortage for several years. It's been really hard to recruit staff and to hold on to them because the pay isn't very good and the opportunities for promotion and training are very limited in lots of schools and other settings. So there's going to be a review of the pay and looking at it much more as a career so that there's opportunities to develop and that staff will be retained because we know how important they are within education. Leaders in schools will be mentored and trained. And also, although this is about high quality staff, this chapter also talks about the investment in the building programme because it recognises, even with a great team of people, if you're in a building that's falling apart, it's not accessible, then it's not a good environment. So there's another lot of money being set aside for maintenance and renewal, so rebuilding.
I think it's worth saying that the government is saying that this overall white paper is not about saving money or reducing investment. It is about making the system, they say, sustainable for the future, but it's not about cuts.
There's a real emphasis on schools working together. So a little bit confusing because they're referring to trusts. They want schools to work together as trusts. Now, this is not the same as an academy trust, although it might involve academies. So the idea is that in an area, you will have all the local schools working together, so supporting each other with expertise on inclusion, on SEND, with sharing equipment, everything, so that all the schools in the areas benefit. So a local trust might be made up of some standalone schools, and there could be some who are already in an academy trust, which could be national, but they will be in a local trust. Now, there's also the power is being given to local authorities to set up trusts. And already Brighton and Hove have spoken about how they're going to set up a trust. So they will manage this group of local schools. Inspections will be looking closely at how the trusts are performing. But the other side of that is that there will be a less keen focus on that school level inspection. So there's a plus and a minus for that. So it's great that these trusts will be looking at how they all work together so that you don't have some schools which are great in the area and some which aren't so great. The idea is to level up so that everyone is a good school. However, there might be that concern that you're losing that close look at your individual school. So the trust might be doing well, but what about if you feel that your school isn't doing so well? But there is a proposal that there will be an annual parent carer forum for trust so that you as parent carers will have the opportunity to formally meet with that trust to express your views. So, chapter 7, enabling innovation and ambition. So there's a lot in this chapter about looking to the future and about how, as we already know, the world is changing rapidly and what the world will look like in 20 or 30 years for our children now is going to be completely different. We can't even imagine what it's going to look like. So the education system needs to be able to adapt and move with those changes. They're saying there's no point having a curriculum which is fixed now because actually the knowledge and the skills that you're offering to children and young people may not be what's needed in 10 or 20 years' time. So there needs to be a sharing of innovation. So where there are schools doing this really well, that needs to be nationally shared so that everyone benefits. There's going to be increased funding for technology in schools and training for staff and children and young people in how to use that technology. So it's no point giving everyone a state-of-the-art laptop if you're not getting the most out of them. So it's really looking at how that can be improved. There's a recognition that technologies are going to be completely different from what we have now. Things like AI, it's not going to be something that you can opt in and out of. It's going to be everywhere. So it's making sure that our children and young people and our educators are ready for that and are using those tools. So there's a recognition that AI tools will be part of teaching and learning. It's not going to be an add-on, but what they want is that we have continue with face-to-face teaching, so there'll still be a teacher in a classroom, but they'll be using AI tools. So that means that within the class, there could be a lot going on with AI, but it doesn't really specify how much will be going on not with teachers. So, is there a point where children will just be at home using AI with, going in for a couple of hours a week to see the teachers? We just don't know, and maybe that's part of the issue that they're saying we have to develop. But that is the plus and the minus to that. We're looking to the future, but we're not quite sure what it's going to be that we're buying into.
So we've talked you through all the important chapters in the white paper and the bits in them that relate to SEND. Now, just repeating the fact this is a white paper, and that means that there's a consultation and that we all have a chance to try and influence which bits of the white paper go ahead into the green paper and potentially become law. Things can be added, things can be amended, changes can be made, and would really encourage everyone to consider responding to the consultation. You might want to read the whole white paper. I mean, I hope having heard this explanation, it'll be easier to digest because you kind of know a bit about what you're reading. There is an easy read version. To be honest, we don't think that's brilliant. It doesn't really it's not that helpful, perhaps, in understanding it more easily. The consultation's open until the 18th of May. You can just send an email with a few comments if you want to, but it probably makes sense to use the online consultation format. There's a lot of free text boxes in it, so you can say what you think. Sometimes with consultations, they almost force you into saying yes, no answers about things that are a bit more complex. It is more sophisticated than that, this consultation. There are things that it doesn't ask about that you might want to include. For example, it doesn't say much about rights of appeal, current potential changes to your current legal rights in SEND. And, you might want to add that into some of your answers that, if you feel that it's important that the law offers a certain level of protection and that might not be so great under, say, the system of ISPs and targeted plus, that might be something that you want to add. We will be responding to the consultation as Amaze. Your parent carer forums will be responding as well. You can be part of that, but it is worth putting in individual responses. One thing that we've been told is that the government will be using AI to capture what comes in from all the consultation responses, which sounds negative, but actually means that they will all, in a sense, be counted. And if certain things are coming up again and again, because many, many people are saying them, AI will pick those things out. So I suppose we are sort of urging you to give it a go, and we will try and put out some more sort of supportive information that might help you think about how to answer the consultation questions and cover the key points that probably worry most people. And also, I think in the consultation responses, it's going to be important to say, yes, the bits that we want, yes, we want mainstream schools to be more inclusive. We want more reasonable adjustments for our children in behaviour policies. We like, I think, more inclusion bases. We like more consistency across the system. So in a sense, it shouldn't matter where you live or which school you go to, that certain things are universal and promised, and children don't get pushed from pillar to post. So also to sort of pick out on the things that you want that are in the proposals, as well as anything that you might be concerned about. That's the end of our presentation. I can see that there are many questions in the chat.
I'm going to field that.
So I'll hand over to Charlotte.
Hi, everybody. Just to acknowledge that it's been a really interesting and passionate debate in the chat. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm just going to focus on questions that were asked. So the first question was, will EHCPs continue to be maintained until age 25? If yes, what changes, if any, will there be? If not, please explain what's the longest we can expect our children who already have an EHCP to access. I think we answered that question, but the first part of that question, will they continue to be to maintained until age 25.
Yes, they haven't changed the 0 to 25 scope of SEND provision generally. So yeah, no change to that.
There are questions about resources, and I'll start with this one. This might actually answer some later questions. We know that there is funding that we described, but the question was, is there enough about how schools will be resourced, as there seems to be a big emphasis on them delivering a lot of this? If so, do you think the resources are sufficient?
Well, there's a lot of money being proposed. That's what we can say. Of course, once it's spread out between all of the schools in the country, it suddenly becomes less money. So there's a mention of 1.6 billion over 3 years. Focused on inclusion, and 1.8 billion over 3 years to create the experts in hand. So that there's a lot of money being put into the system, but we know that these are proposals, and by the time we actually come to the changes, it could look very different. Having a proposed amount of money is not the same as having it ring fenced so that we know in 3 years' time it's going to be used for that purpose. That's the risk.
I think the message is about putting the resources where the children are. So giving more resources to schools so that they can be more inclusive rather than moving the children out of their local school and the resource following the child. That's a big shift. And if money isn't ring fenced, what are the other pressures on schools for spending? You know, we've seen that in the past. So I think that's something that one might want to put in a consultation response. You know, should the additional resources that schools get be more clearly ring fenced? There's certainly going to be additional resources for schools, but will they be safe held for our children?
Next question. How will the new legal inclusion duties be enforced at a tribunal? So we're talking about the duties on schools here from the early part of the presentation. Even ensuring EHCPs are enforced is an expensive challenge. So what are the legal enforcement instances for the new type of targeted support, etc.?
Well, I think that's one of the concerns. You know, there is discussion in there about the new complaints process within schools and these independent complaints panels, the fact that the tribunal is still available, but there are parts of this which are very vague. It doesn't explain how you will actually hold a school. So they might create an independent support plan and they might renew it annually, but what if they're not delivering it? That's more of the detail which I think we need to be asking for in the consultation.
Yes, I think one of the concerns there will be for schools as well is about these school complaints processes. You know, I think if you're a school or a school governor, you know, you're going to be thinking, well, at the moment we can say it's the local authority's fault, but you know, if it becomes our fault, how are we going to manage that? What's our relationship with parents going to be like if, in order to get what they feel they need, they're going to have to go through a school complaints process? So it's an interesting one.
And remembering that school governors are volunteers, so actually we're moving this process onto volunteers and away from the local authority. That's the proposal.
That kind of leads nicely into there were a couple of comments about how will they staff the changes, which I think the latter part of the presentation answered, and about, is there anything about changing the criteria for the recruitment of teachers?
No, nothing about that. More about SEND training in teacher, but I have heard so many times that they're going to add more training about SEND to teacher education. So I hope that it's a much more substantial amount added to the universal teacher training than has happened in the past.
But the next bit was, it looks like the onus will be put on schools to identify and provide support rather than being able to rely on an EHCP, which carries statutory weight. There's a worry about the quality of provision. Do we think the quality of provision would vary depending on the quality and attitude of individual members of staff?
I think that's always the case, but I think there's an attempt to address that with, you know, Ofsted inspecting with inclusion as a priority, and creating these groups or trusts so schools kind of almost both supporting and policing each other. So there won't be an incentive for a school to perhaps not be so supportive, so children that they see as being expensive or hard work go elsewhere because they will be in a relationship with those other schools. So I think there's attempts being made to try and address that a bit.
Okay, the next question is basically, is there anything in there about how the government's going to ensure that all students with SEN can access wraparound care, such as breakfast clubs? The additional stuff. Is there anything in there about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a real push for inclusion in all areas. The white paper is saying this isn't just about the teaching and learning provision; it's everything that the school does, all the enrichment activities, anything that any outings, all of that should be inclusive. That's what the push is to try and address that.
Thank you. A couple of questions about these independent panels that will be deciding on the complaints for the individual support plans. Do we have any idea who these people might be?
No.
No, there's no detail about that at the moment. That's definitely something that in our consultation response we'll be asking about.
Someone raises the point about these new packages, these specialist support packages, and these templates. Concerns about whether they'll be individualised enough. Do we have any comment on that?
That's an interesting one, and I think the 7 areas of need and won't list them, but you can see them in the white paper, are quite well chosen.
Yeah.
They're quite sensible. They're obviously based on understanding of education and children. But what's going to be the details of what the kinds of provision that will be in them and how much scope there will be in that for it is about a degree of standardization without a doubt. And there's 2 sides to standardization. Standardization on the one hand can make things fairer and mean that you're not disadvantaged if you live in an area that's less committed or less good, say, or at a school that's less committed or less good. But the flip side of standardization is does it work for every individual child so well?
I think with EHCPs, at the moment, there is a concern that the provision you would get in one area is tied with what's actually available. So we've got loads of this service in our area, so we can afford to give it to children in the EHCPs, whereas another area that has a shortage might not be putting it into the EHCPs. So a possible positive is that because you're looking at a child's need and all of the provision that's required, then there is the duty for the local authority to provide that. It shouldn't be based on, or we haven't got enough occupational therapy in our area. So that's a possible plus side to it.
And I think the government in this white paper is putting a lot of faith in this experts at hand program. So the idea is that there will be easier access at an earlier stage to educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, those people that we know are really important in identifying what a child needs and making really appropriate suggestions to get their support right. And then that what's in the SSPs will build on that and grow from that. So if they've had the right support, say from a speech and language therapist, and it's not resolved things for them, that they will be identified as needing a specialist provision package that really builds on that and is the next level in that form of support. So in a way, the crucial thing is, will they be able to recruit and train enough and retain enough of these experts at hand for that to be a really solid, reliable system? Or will people still be asking for an education, health and care plan because that's not working?
Thanks. Yeah, just a little. There was a question that just kind of, and I think we might have answered it, is about people with current EHCPs, how the proposals will affect current EHCPs in the tribunal process. Will we lose provision we have fought hard for?
If your child is in year 3 or above, they're guaranteed that they will keep their EHCP until they're 16. For anyone who's got a child in year 2, as we've said, or below, they'll be reassessed at their transition in between year 6 and 7. So you will hold on to those EHCPs if they are needed until those points. There is some weakening of the tribunal. Not having the power to name a school is a big change. That is a really serious proposal, and something that is probably what you're going to want to flag in the consultation process.
I just wanted to add, there will be two systems running for some years in effect, is a thing to bear in mind. So there will be children who are still on the old system, and younger children who come in on the new system or hit one of those, the reassessment point. So, and both systems will run side by side, which may be a little bit tricky for schools during that period to understand.
Thank you. A sort of quite lengthy statement raising the question about how concerned they are at the lack of a clear definition for complex needs.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's one of the key things to pick up on in your consultation responses, and we certainly will. On one level, I think what they're saying is complex needs are needs that are higher than those that can be supported through Targeted Plus. But that, what does that mean? I suppose what is really asking is it moving the bar up? Is it only children with, say, severe learning disabilities that fall into complex needs? There's certainly an assumption in the white paper that, say, just because you have an autism diagnosis wouldn't necessarily mean that you had complex needs. It's do you have an autism diagnosis and need specialist provision, and then you'd fall into that group.
There's a question that I've spotted that we've heard of this on SENDIASS in the advice line as well, where this person has said that the school had started the process to request an education, health and needs care assessment, which might lead to an EHCP, but now they've stopped it because they're saying that her son's view needs will not be complex enough for the future definition. So at the moment, there is no change to the law. The law is the same. No school should be stopping the process or saying, oh, we're not going to put a request in because it's going to change, because all of this is a proposal. None of it has come into law, and we don't even have these definitions yet of what a complex need would be, what an EHCP would be valid for. So you need to push back against your school if they're saying that. It's untrue. They shouldn't be stopping those requests.
Thanks, Liam. A couple of questions saying that there have been whispers that the consultation around the weakened tribunal powers is a done deal, as in that's not, you might feed back on it, but a Law Society article and another post said the same thing, that they've already made up their minds. I don't know whether there's any feedback on
that. We can't second guess that, really. Everyone's trying to, but that's not a reason not to say it loud and see what happens.
Just querying here that someone says it sounds like SSPs are packages that cannot be legally enforced. Is that the case?
Well, an EHCP will be enforceable still. So it's ISPs where there's a legal duty to have them and maintain them. That's the Intervention Support Plan, but it's not clear how they can be legally enforced. And that might be something that we want to say should be the case for them to have teeth. But SSPs are more like a kind of a menu, and then if you need elements of that menu, then you get the Education, Health and Care Plan, which is enforced, but only in the same way that they are at the moment, which we know is varied.
Thank you, Ros. Just to reiterate, you said something about EOTAS. A couple of people have asked again about EOTAS. And if anyone doesn't know what that is, it's education other than in school. As far as we
can tell, the fact that it hasn't been talked about means that existing legislation about EOTAS, like for children that are too sick to attend school, for example, will continue. So there's no indication that the law around EOTAS is changing. But what I would certainly be wanting to ask as a question in the consultation is how are the two things going to interact? These new SEND ways of working and processes with the law around education otherwise than at school for children who can't attend school.
Thank you. Quick question. If a child is in a special school and reaches a transition stage after September 2029, could they be moved out then?
No, it's very clear that children who in 2029 are in special schools will not be asked to move. As say, everyone might say, well, actually, we want to, but if people don't want to, places are safe so that children have continuity in their education.
Thank you. Just a comment about the potential broadness of the experts at hand. You know, our idea that they're all going to be occupational therapists, but someone mentioned a football coach at an event. I don't know whether you've heard anything.
Well, the white paper specifically talks about the specialist services that we would expect, like educational psychologists and occupational therapists. But again, it's a proposal. So, if you are hearing rumblings that it's going to be completely diluted, then that's something for the consultation, confirmation of what services are actually going to be identified. And the response might be, oh, well, if we produce a list, then it excludes other services, but we need to maybe have like a core list of services which will be protected.
Thanks. Question: what happens if the local authority direct to a specialist setting that isn't suitable based on medical or educational psychologist reports, and they're only directing there due to it being cheaper or nothing suitable being available? How can this be appealed?
There will be the right to appeal on an EHCP, and the tribunal, as it stands in the proposals, would be able to tell the local authority that they had to think again. It wouldn't name an alternative school, as we know, but it would say, oh, the school you've proposed isn't a match. And they'd be referring back to, have they picked the right specialist provision packages? Because obviously they've named a school that they say can deliver the packages that, or elements of the packages that your child needs. So maybe they haven't picked the right packages, and that would be the substance of the appeal. So not so dissimilar from appealing the non-school parts of an EHCP now.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions about inclusion bases, or kind of themes around inclusion bases. There's about the buildings. How are schools going to have space for an inclusion space? Our school hasn't even got a place for hasn't got the space for a quiet space. Questions about the balance of who's going to access the inclusion base. But then also about, are they just going to be spaces for internal exclusions? That's actually a different question. That's about on-site suspension. Sorry. So just questions about the inclusion bases, both in terms of the architecture of a school and how they're going to be used.
Well, there is a lot of money being set aside for this programme of maintenance and rebuilding. So in lots of schools will be getting additional spaces or conversions of unused spaces at the moment. The plus and the minus of the proposals are this flexibility about how those spaces are used. So it should mean that you're able to adapt to the needs of the pupils in that particular school. But of course, there is that risk that you can use it for purposes that we wouldn't be so keen on for our children and young people.
And some schools, even with potential investment, there literally just isn't space on site to add something, and that will be a challenge, But it's I guess that's not a reason for the government not to aspire to getting an inclusion base in every school, and it will be for schools and local authorities to try and find solutions.
Thanks. Yes, I'll just return to that question about this business of having exclusions, fixed term suspensions on site, and how that isn't going to just sort of exacerbate mental health things, isolation.
Yeah, again, it is a concern, because actually making someone sit in a room, potentially unstaffed even, for the rest of the day, we know how impactful that is on children and young people. So it's a case of, here's a proposal. Yes, in lots of cases, it probably is better than just sending someone off and then a parent having to take a day off work, for example, and all of the repercussions. But so it's about the support that goes, recognising need. I mean, there is talk in here about things like behaviour policies moving away just from sanctions and having a reward system. So they're trying to recognise something that needs to be more specific to an individual child's needs. And we would hope that involves the sanctions as well, that if there is a suspension, you're identifying those children and how that will be administered within the school safely, so that it has a positive impact on them, and you're reducing any risk of that having a really negative impact on their mental health.
A couple of questions about the consultation. What do we know about the accountability of the consultation process, if anything?
That's a really good question. I think there will be national organisations like Contact and IPSI and so on, Disabled Children's Partnership, that will publish what their consultation response has been. So it'll be obvious if the government hasn't listened. The National Network of Parent Carer Forums are going to be all over it, and do talk to and get involved in the parent carer forums in our area to their consultation response. But I mean, I suppose the other thing is to think about influencing MPs, because ultimately this will go through Parliament. So if what comes out after the consultation is there were really strong messages from the community, both people who work in education and us as families, and those aren't listened to, then it would be about asking MPs to amend the legislation as it goes through Parliament to closer match what people have brought up in the consultation.
Thanks, Ros. Somebody did ask whether they should email their MP, and I think the answer is yes.
But it might be that it would make sense to save that till the next stage, when the consultation is complete and it's moving to the next phase, getting closer to law, and the MPs having more influence over it.
I think there are a few more questions. If you're in secondary school, will you keep your current EHCP to follow through to college if you're in year 9?
Yes.
Yes. The DfE have posted that complex needs are those which cannot be met by what is ordinarily available in mainstream classrooms, which is the same definition as we have now.
But that's one of those definitions that, it's not a fixed thing, is it? Because it depends on what becomes ordinarily available. So I think what they're saying is we're going to try and up what's ordinarily available in a mainstream classroom so as to push the threshold of where you need an education, health and care plan at least up. That's definitely an aim. And we might see, more inclusivity is a positive. You shouldn't need an education, health and care plan process for children with needs that lots of children have and that schools should be able to get on and meet. But will it be pushed up too high is perhaps the question.
Thanks, Ros. A question here. Will the schools named in lists only be mainstream or Section 41 schools? How will independent schools be accessed?
Oh, this is an interesting one, and Liam touched on it earlier. So alongside the white paper and faster, there's a very specific thrust of work happening from the DfE around independent special schools. So the Section 41 schools will become it will become an irrelevant thing, that basically all independent special schools are going to be subject to new standards and new pricing kind of restrictions in effect. So what is happening at the moment, as many of you may be aware, is that there are basically private investment trusts making an absolute killing out of independent special schools. And because local authorities have not got sufficient provision, they're having to agree to send children to schools that are essentially ripping off public money. So the government has said we're going to grasp this nettle. That should mean that maybe some independent special schools won't continue to operate, but those that do, parents and children should have potentially a freer choice of using those schools, because it won't be that the local authority is desperately trying to avoid a school that costs £200,000 a year if they're all going to be brought within a sort of an agreed pricing sort of system.
Thanks, Ros. Someone says their concern is about the tightening of elective homeschooling laws. It appears every child must be in mainstream education, regardless of if it is of benefit to them.
Again, that's a bit of legislation that isn't being changed by this white paper. So the right to choose to educate at home, it will be unchanged. There is another piece of legislation going through at the moment, which is about, it's legislation that's about children, more about children's sort of well-being, mental well-being and welfare. And that includes some proposals around closer monitoring of children that are electively home educated. So checking that they are flourishing, checking that they're actually getting an education. But the right to electively home educate is not being taken away and is not affected by either this white paper or the other piece of legislation that's being proposed.
Just a couple left. Do we know if the reassessment at transition will be based on age or phase of education? thinking ahead, as it may affect children out of cohort, for example, summer-born children who are, they're going in a year later on. There's that flexibility now.
For the EHCPs, it's phase-based. So if a child is moving into primary or into secondary or into college age, that would be the point when the EHCP would be reviewed.
Thanks, Liam. Just a comment that it is worth writing to your MP now, because inside stories that local authorities are already being asked to shape how they might, deliver the reform plans. So it's worth getting involved now. And finally, just relating to the independent special schools here, just adding on to that, what happens if there are no new pupils? If this happens and there are no new pupils, what happens to current pupils in independent schools if they can't afford to stay open? I don't think we have an answer to that one.
Yeah, no,
I think they're going to close, aren't they, if they haven't got any pupils in there, and they're not. Well, if they're not judged to be of sufficient standard.
Well,
Yeah.
what we'd hope is that they make sure that their quality is good and that their prices are based on what's actually delivered, rather than generating extreme amounts of profit, because then they will be viable schools.
Thank you. That is the end of the really significant set of questions there in the chat.
And this is just a reminder about staying in touch with us. If you've got individual questions that wouldn't have been appropriate to bring up here, you can contact SENDIASS, and if you're not currently, do use our online registration form, because that means that you get the spelling of your name right and your address and so on, and don't waste time on the phone covering things like that. So that's the most efficient way to do it. Do use our website for information. Do sign up for our newsletter, because we will keep putting information about the white paper, and as it progresses, we will have regular items about it in the newsletter, so it's a good way to stay informed.